Shalom everyone, this is the second episode of the book of Genesis, and today I'll be talking about the creation of the world that we find in Genesis chapter 1. The narrative is very interesting at first, but then became intimidating once I seriously tried to understand. Actually, the story is very familiar to me, and I believe it is the same for you as well, because it is something that I have been reading as a Christian for a long time now, and I even memorized the whole chapter a few years ago. So I was confident that I understood the passage. But then this time when I started to read it and started to study the passage, so many questions came up. And I realized that I don't have enough knowledge to answer all those questions that came up in the process of my reading. Consequently, all the confidence that I had, come tumbling down like the wall of Jericho. See, the creation account of Genesis is one of the highly controversial portions of the Bible. And somehow this time I could see a glimpse of why that is so. And I believe everyone who comes to this passage, or any other passage of the Bible for that matter, and interprets it has one common intention, and that is to be true to God's word, to be as faithful as possible to the word of God. But somehow, we come out with different understandings, different interpretations, and resulting into different groups like young earth creationists, all earth creationist, evolutionary creationist, or theistic evolutionist, and even maybe even more, I don't know. And as for me, I don't know to which of these groups I would fit in. But all I'm doing is to make sense of what the Bible is saying, and also as everyone else to be faithful in my interpretation. Anyways, the creation account of Genesis starts with these words. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Genesis 1, verses 1, 2, 3. These are the three opening verses of the book of Genesis. Just 3 verses, okay? But then I learned that there are lots of differences as to how these verses should be translated and then how they should be interpreted. I don't intend to go into all the details of what the biblical scholars are discussing, but there are a few things that I want to mention here. First, is verse 1, and especially the phrase "in the beginning." Is this phrase referring to the beginning of everything, so that before Genesis 1:1 there was nothing except God? What I mean is the writer of Genesis referring to that absolute beginning of everything, when he wrote, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth"? While I believe that there must have been a point in time, well, even though there may not be a time before the creation, but just for the sake of our understanding, where there was nothing else except God. Well, I believe that, but in this case, I think I will go with scholars who understand Genesis 1:1 as an introduction or as a summary to the following verses, rather than referring to that point of absolute beginning. The reason behind this position is that in Genesis, the writer repeatedly uses the phrase, "These are the generations of," or "This is the account of," as a way of introducing or summarizing what is coming in the following verses or section. For example, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created," chapter 2, verse 4. "These are the generations of Noah," chapter 6, verse 9. And the last one is, "These are the generations of Jacob," chapter 37, verse 2. And you can see the whole list in the description box below. And for me personally, Genesis chapter 2, verse 1, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them," is a very fitting conclusion to the "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth" introduction of chapter 1, verse 1. Second, I've always thought that light was the first thing that God created. I don't know how this understanding came about, probably because I've not seriously thought about what I was reading whenever I read Genesis. And so, since light was the first thing that God created on the first day, maybe I thought that was the first thing that God created in the Genesis creation account. Whatever the reason was, now I realize that before light was created in day 3, before light was created in verse 3, which was also the first day of creation, we already have at least 2 things, earth and water, in verse 2. And this verse 2 of Genesis chapter 1, is one of the verses that has always left me perplexed whenever I read Genesis. But I never try to check out what it means, even during my 6 years time in Bible college. I don't know why I didn't try. Anyway, I'm glad that I'm learning now, and I believe it is a good sign. Now, what does it mean when it says that there was earth, but it was without form and void, or formless and void? Without form and void, or formless and void, refers to the condition of the earth that was chaotic, disordered, uninhabitable, unproductive, and which is also filled with darkness. And indeed, it is a frightening picture even to think of, right? It was the state of the earth where there was no life and there was no possibility to produce life, according to John V. Miller and John M. Soden. And prophet Jeremiah also saw a vision similar to this in chapter 4, verses 23 to 26, which is a darkened and devastated earth from which life and order have fled. Jeremiah says, I looked on the earth, and behold, it was without form and void, and to the heavens, and they have no light. I looked on the mountains, and behold, they were quaking, and the hills moved to and fro. And I looked, and behold, there was no man, and all the birds of the air have fled. And I looked, and behold, the fruitful land was a desert, and all its cities were laid in ruins before the Lord for his fierce anger. So this is the kind of condition that Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 is talking about, with the distinction that in Genesis the earth was a watery mass. Having said this, the next question is then, what kind of creation is the one that we find in Genesis? All these years I thought the kind of creation recorded in Genesis is the one is where God speaks and things just appear immediately. Well, this shows how carelessly I've been reading the Bible. This time I realized that actually that kind of creation is only in the case of light, which is on the first day, where God says, let there be light, and there was light. Now, John Walton proposes the 6 days creation in Genesis as all about assigning roles and function, rather than an account of material creation. Though I agree with him, considering what I've just said, I believe it is not possible to totally rule out the material creation, considering the creation of light and particularly the creation of humans on day 6. Having said that, I believe creation in Genesis is more about bringing order and organization from chaos and disorganization that we see in verse 2, though not limited to it, as I said. Gordon Wenham also understands the creation story of Genesis as an account of ordering of different parts of the universe. The frightening disorganization, Wenham's term, of verse 2 was transformed into the world that we see at the end of chapter 1 through the creative work of God. So God transformed this dark, chaotic, and watery earth into a beautiful, productive, and meaningful world. And we can look at the phrase, the heavens and the earth, that we find in chapter 1 verse 1 and chapter 2 verse 1. The phrase means the totality of the universe, and also the universe that is ordered and organized. where everything has its proper place and function. This seems to make sense when I think about the destination of all God's people, which is not heaven, though majority of Christians think it is, but a new heaven and a new earth, where all the brokenness, disorder, and darkness that we see and experience and live with at the moment will be gone. A renewed and restored heaven and earth called a new heaven and a new earth. This is truly an eye-opening for me. I've never understood creation in this way. I'm so glad and I'm thankful to God that now I'm beginning to understand Genesis. Okay, so now what is the theological point of this creation narrative? I think the first and obvious point is that God is the creator of everything. He's the one who created everything that is in existence. And I think the Nicene Creed captures this point very well when it says, "We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, of all things visible and invisible." Second, the creation account is making the point that there is only one God and not many, as the neighboring nations thought. For example, in Enuma Elish, there were many gods and goddesses, and there was this fight between the older gods and the younger gods. And creation came about when Marduk defeated the primordial chaos, or Tiamat. Talking about the primordial chaos, it should be noted that in the neighboring cultures, this primordial chaos is usually personalized. For example, in Enuma Elish, this primordial chaos was none other than the great goddess Tiamat. In Egyptian culture, the primordial water was a god named Nun. Not only that, other created things like the sun, moon, and earth were all considered as some kind of gods or goddesses. For the Egyptians, the sun is god Atum, the sky is goddess Nut, and the earth is a god called Geb, who is also the husband of goddess Nut. But in the Bible, all these things are not expressed in any personalized way. They are not god or goddesses in any way. They are just creation of the one and only sovereign God. Third, the creation story also tells us that God is different from everything He created. In the Egyptian creation myth, Atum, the creator god, emerged out of the primordial water. But in Genesis, God did not emerge out of the water or anything. In Enuma Elish, the fresh and sweet water is god Apsu, and the salty and bitter water is goddess Tiamat. But in Genesis account, God is never expressed in that way. God is not part of the created material. He is above and over and sovereign over all created things. One final point. I think it is right to say that Genesis, and particularly this creation account, because this is where people tend to do, should not be considered as giving us, scientific information regarding the world and how the world was exactly created. Because if we read Genesis and try to interpret it in terms of modern science, I think the message of the book will be messed up, because Genesis was not written for that purpose. Rather, it is a book about God revealing who He is to the people of Israel in the way they can understand. Revelation was given within the cultural framework of the ancient Israelites. Okay, if God was talking about creation in the process of revealing Himself to the people, then God was speaking to them in their own language, according to how people of the time understood the world. I really like what John Walton says. Genesis was written for us, but it was not written to us. Even though Genesis was written for us, it was first written to the people of Israel, who lived a long time ago. I think we should keep this principle in mind as we continue to read Genesis and also the rest of the Bible. Thank you for listening to my talk today. I'll be talking about the creation of humans in my next video, and I look forward to seeing you there. Until then, take care and God bless you.